Have you ever really thought about how that board game or that basketball actually got into your hands? I mean, it seems simple enough, right? But behind every single toy and piece of sports gear, there's this massive, complex global industry. And for the investors who fund these companies, finding the hidden risks and all that complexity, well, that's the whole game. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the blueprint they use to do just that, the Toys and Sporting Goods Sustainability Standard.
So what we're looking at here is something called the SASB standards. The easiest way to think about them is like a nutrition label, but for investors. Instead of checking for calories or sugar, these labels highlight the specific sustainability risks that could actually damage a company's financial health. And for the toy and sports industry, that means zeroing in on the unique dangers that are kind of hiding in the business of fun.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to map out the business of play itself. Then, we'll get into the two biggest risks that have investors paying close attention. After that, we'll put product safety under a microscope, take a hard look at the supply chain, and finally, see how it all comes together on the investor's scorecard.
Okay, first up, let's get a handle on the industry's blueprint. I mean, what are we really talking about when we say toys and sporting goods? It's actually a little more complicated than you might imagine.
So the industry's DNA is basically split into two big camps. You've got toys and games on one side and sporting goods on the other. Most of these products end up in our hands through regular old retail stores. But here's the really crucial part. How they get made is all over the map. Some companies own their factories, top to bottom. Others outsource literally everything. And that one choice, whether to build it themselves or buy it from someone else, that changes everything about the kinds of risks they're facing.
So when you've got this wild mix of in-house factories and outsourced partners all feeding into this huge global supply chain, it begs the question, right? What are the hidden risks that could suddenly pop up and cause a major problem?
And that question brings us right to the core of this standard. Because after analyzing this entire industry, it boils everything down to just two major risk areas that investors absolutely need to have on their radar.
And here they are, the two big ones. First, you've got chemical and safety hazards. Pretty simple, right? Is the product itself physically safe for you and your family to use? And second, labor conditions in the supply chain. Are the people who are actually making these products being treated ethically? And it all comes back to that business model we just talked about, with its heavy reliance on manufacturing. That's why these two areas are the flashpoints where things can go wrong and directly hit a company's bottom line.
All right, let's dig into that first risk, product safety. And believe me, this goes way, way beyond just worrying if a toy is going to break.
So a word you're going to hear a lot is recall. This is the formal process of yanking a potentially dangerous product off of store shelves and, even more critically, out of people's homes. It is an absolute nightmare for a company, whether they decide to do it themselves or are forced into it by regulators. It's the worst-case scenario.
Okay, so how do you actually measure a risk like this? The standard asks for two key numbers. First, the total number of recalls a company has had. But the second one is often more telling, the total number of units that were recalled. And that second number? That's the one that really shows you the scale of the disaster. A single recall could mean pulling millions of individual products back, which is just a financial and logistical catastrophe.
And this quote right here just nails why investors care so much. A safety failure isn't just a little bad press. No way. It leads to incredibly expensive recalls, mountains of lawsuits, and the kind of damage to a company's reputation that can crush sales and send its stock price into a nosedive. Now, a huge part of this is managing chemicals safely, and companies tend to use one of two playbooks. The hazard-based approach is super straightforward. If a chemical is known to be bad, you just don't use it, period. The risk-based approach, on the other hand, is more of a calculation. It asks, okay, this chemical isn't great, but what are the actual chances someone will be exposed to it in a harmful way? The standard makes companies tell investors which playbook they're using, which is a huge signal about how cautious or how much of a risk taker they really are.
All right, so we've talked about the product itself. Now let's pivot and talk about the people who actually make it. This is all about taking responsibility for the entire supply chain.
And really, this is the heart of the problem. That business model we mentioned often means companies outsource their manufacturing to third-party factories. And those factories are frequently in parts of the world where labor laws and, just as importantly, the enforcement of those laws might be a little weak. This opens these companies up to huge risks around worker safety, their health, and their basic human rights.
So what's a company to do? Well, they rely on a four-step audit process. First, they lay down the law with a supplier code of conduct. Second, they send auditors to the factories to see if those rules are actually being followed. Third, they write down every single problem they find. These are called non-conformances. And finally, and this is the most important step, they have to make sure the factory actually has a plan to fix every single one of those problems. But here's the thing, not all slip-ups are the same. A priority non-conformance is basically a code red. We're talking about a major safety risk or an outright violation of the law that needs to be dealt with immediately. Other non-conformances are still serious. They're still violations of the code of conduct, but they don't have that same 5-alarm fire urgency. Companies have to report on how often they find and, most importantly, fix both kinds of these violations.
Okay, so we've looked at the product, we've looked at the people. Now, how does all this information get rolled up into something an investor can actually use to make a decision? Well, that's where the scorecard comes in.
And this, right here, is the whole point. These standards are all about connecting these sustainability issues to cold, hard cash. The goal is to get companies reporting on the specific risks that could realistically hurt their cash flow, their ability to get a loan from a bank, or how much that loan is going to cost them. It makes these abstract ideas really tangible and financially important.
But all that risk data doesn't mean much without some context, right? That's where these activity metrics are so important. Knowing that a company makes, say, 50 million toys a year, or that 90% of its factories are outsourced to third parties, that gives an investor the sense of scale they need to really understand how exposed that company is to the risks we've been talking about. And at the end of the day, that's the real magic of this whole thing. These standards create a clear, consistent language that everyone can understand. Companies can report on their performance, and investors can use that data to see how they stack up against their competitors. It just cuts through all the marketing fluff and gets everyone focused on what truly matters for the long-term health of the business.
So think about it. The next time you grab a board game for family night or swing a new golf club, are you going to think a little differently about that invisible, complex web of safety checks, factory audits, and financial risks that had to be managed just to bring that one little moment of fun into your life?